Big round of applause.
Thank you. Am I on? Am I on? Am I on? Am I on? Okay, I'm on. Thank you, and thank you for making it dramatic. I'm all about the drama, so let's do this. Hello, Codeland. Woo! There we go. Almost like you're getting paid to say hello. All right, good job. So my name, as you can see, is Bianca Escalante, and for the last 3-ish or so years, I have been part of the social impact team at GitHub, and I've dabbled in community management. Being on the social impact team during this time has been sort of exciting and transformative, and phenomenal and heartbreaking. But more than anything, as a former nonprofit employee, being on the social impact team has been like the educational experience of a lifetime. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the personal impact that being on social impact has had on me a little bit later. But first I want to go over some content notes. There will be references to racism, eugenics, and online harassment in this talk. I'm not going to spend too much time on these things, but I did want to mention that in advance. Okay, so here we go. Guess what? I was eavesdropping. Again, yeah. So I know it's not always right, but this is one of the ways in which I learn, is by listening in on other people's conversations. Yeah. So some folks I know were discussing the idea of open source for good. And the argument that was being made was that we should not say open source for good. And they had 3 reasons for why we should not say open source for good, right? And reason number 1 is designating certain projects as open source for good denigrates projects who might not have an obvious or direct social impact, but are the building blocks of those more obvious and direct open source socially impactful projects, right? And I was like, okay, this sounds a little participation trophy-ish, but you know, that's another talk for another day. So reason number 2 was all open source is good because it's free and it's open. And I was like, yeah, and all lives matter, and not all men. And sometimes I just want to put the word all on my mute list, because I'm not here for that. And lastly, the last argument that they were making was saying open source for good is wrong because it implies that there is such a thing as open source for bad. And that's not okay. Okay, so be real with me, because I think that's my future. I'm sitting there like wondering, asking myself for the millionth time, why we insist on perpetuating this myth that open source can never be negative or harmful despite concrete evidence that indicates otherwise, okay? So let's do this, let's go there. Unfortunately, I only have about 10 more minutes left, so I'm going to do the best I can to provide you with compelling evidence in that short amount of time. Rest assured, I can talk about this for several hours. Be grateful that no one from our terms of service team is actually giving this talk, because you'd be trapped for days. And I'm going to take that back. Okay, I don't want to say one negative thing about that team, because they are some of the most empathetic and kind and thoughtful human beings you will ever meet, and the work that they do definitely does not get the credit or the recognition that it deserves. So here we go. All right. Here we have a user who is being harassed to the point of being suicidal. Now, how are they being harassed is the interesting aspect of this. In this particular case, the harasser was leaving really cruel comments all over this person's project. But what was interesting is that the harassment was relentless. And the way that the harassment was relentless was because the harasser was running an open source script that was using automated account creation to create new GitHub accounts with junk email addresses. So the second we would go in and shut down the account for harassment, another one would pop up almost instantly and continue the harassment because of the script that they were running to be able to do that. And yes, obviously, we have amazing people who are working on issues like this, but this issue is actually really prevalent. All right, so next. Okay, this is an auto blocker, and in this particular project, you can use this auto blocker to block the SJWs on Twitter and on Facebook. So it's a script that blocks people on other platforms. If anybody doesn't know what an SJW is, it stands for Social Justice Warrior. In other words, somebody who really cares about justice and fairness in society. How dare they? But if you're looking for less Black Lives Matter and more Pepe the Frog in your timeline, like here you go, All right, so here's another one. You can also decide who can have access to your project based on their race or gender. This is an OAuth app that was created, and what it does is it pulls information from a major website that does DNA testing, and it can either grant or restrict access based on whatever that person chooses. And what could possibly go wrong, right? It's not like, is that me? Okay. It's not like there's anybody who works in the tech industry who actually believes that certain races or genders are superior to others, right? It's not like that exists in tech. What the hell did I get in there? What? I put it in there. Okay, so I was recently watching the Justice League on a flight, and there was this really relevant conversation, and I'm not about to spoil anything, I promise. In this conversation, Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, is talking to Diana Prince, aka Wonder Woman, and they are trying to decide whether or not to use a mother box to perform an ethically ambiguous task. I told you I wouldn't spoil it. Okay, so not to be the person that reads from slides, but I'm about to read from a slide. So Bruce Wayne says, but this is science beyond our limits, and that's what science is for, to do what's never been done to make life better. And Wonder Woman responds, or to end it. Technology is like any other power. Without reason, without heart, it destroys us. So before I get to the main point, let's just pause for a second and consider that what we have here is a really powerful woman checking a white man whose only real power is that he's super rich. It's true. On a moral argument, that was really satisfying. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. So let's rewind. Let's go back to our first project, automated account creation, right? So what if you are an HR professional and you are in the midst of a hiring blitz, and creating accounts for all these new employees is taking really long. So one of your developers comes up to you and says, look, I figured out how you can automate all of this work. And we can automate this for you, and now instead you can spend more time doing the more human aspects of your job, those that can't be automated, right? Automated account creation. So the auto blocker. What if there is certain content on Facebook or Twitter that can be really damaging to someone struggling with PTSD? What if they need a way to block certain triggers? What if this can be instrumental to someone's mental health? It's an auto blocker. And back to genetic access. What if you're a Black woman or someone from another marginalized community in tech, and you want to participate in open source free of judgment and free of harassment, and yes, maybe even within a community that you have a shared background or shared experience with, right? So here's the real deal, and we've kind of touched on this earlier, but I'm so excited that the talks have kind of been building up to this. Oh, so initially the slide just said code is neutral, but I haven't finished reading Algorithms of Oppression, and so I added mostly because I'll get back to you on that. But at the end of the day, what I want to point out is it's actually not the technology in and of itself, it's the people behind it, right? So the main point, open source can most certainly be good or bad because people will use it for good or bad. And notice I didn't say people can use it for good or bad. I said people will use it for good or bad. And while boiling it down to the words good or bad is like problematic for a lot of reasons, the main idea still stands. Wonder Woman knew this. Technology is like any other power. Without reason, without heart, it destroys us. And open source isn't the only technology that we need to be looking at, right? Does anyone remember this? Back in 2016 when Microsoft, we're here, released an AI bot on Twitter, and she was basically like processing what people were feeding her, and within less than 24 hours, they had to shut her down because she'd become this like Hitler-loving, misogynistic, racist, immigrant-hating, like all the things you can imagine. And so Microsoft was like, okay, we're gonna shut her down. Now, I know that's not an open source project, but if you're wondering, it can be. So, my point is we cannot forget or ignore this stuff. Otherwise, it can destroy us. And yes, we're talking about open source, and destroy is a strong word. We're not talking about famine, I get it. But the main point still stands. And I think it's time that we start admitting that while code may be neutral, we are not. None of us. And so let's take a second to apply a little bit more human philosophy to open source since we're already here. How many of us have ever heard the saying? So your greatest asset is your greatest liability. I've heard it, I've used it, and like, I know, how many folks are new-ish to open source and coding? Let's raise hands, that's a lot. Okay, I'm gonna crush some dreams today. I'm just kidding, I'm gonna be super, super gentle. What if some of open source's greatest assets might also be some of its greatest liabilities? Right? In all of the examples that I went through earlier, some of the things that we love about open source actually make it quite easy to be abused. Right? Let's keep in mind, open source is free. There's no financial barrier other than the cost of a computer and internet. You don't have to pay to contribute to open source. I'm not advocating for a financial barrier, let me make that perfectly clear. I'm just pointing this out, right? Open source is a community of people. I think it was Gotham earlier that was saying, it's less about the code and it's more about the community. It's people, lots of people, millions of people. Do you get what I'm saying? Some of them are like you, some of them might not be. And lastly, so remember when I was talking about the automated account creation pulling from the junk email addresses? The reason that was easy was because all you need to create an account is an email address. So in making the technical barrier to entry quite low, we've maybe set ourselves up for something. Okay, before you go and accuse me of advocating for the abolishment of open source, it's not what I'm doing, okay? Fear not. I'm gonna be like Wonder Woman. Fear not. I will give you some tips, and together we can save open source. Okay, sorry, that was too much. So I'm going to submit for your consideration some questions to consider, right? You can ask these when you're creating your own project or when you're going to start contributing to a project. And in particular, the first and last are the ones I want to draw your attention to. Ask yourself this, is this good? Does this represent progress? And what are the values I want to bring to this community, and how can I do that? So remember earlier when I said I was going to talk about the personal impact that being on social impact has had on me? This is where I tell kind of an embarrassing story. When I first started working at GitHub, I was like, I'm neutral, right? I don't, one way or the other, open source, good or bad. Me and my contributions, like I don't have positive, I don't have negative. I'm totally neutral about this, right? I didn't understand much about how to GitHub or how to open source. So I didn't think I thought I fell into that sort of neutral space. But then I actually started connecting this work to people. And I started realizing the superpowers that I and you all might actually have here. I realized that my newness was something that could actually be leveraged. I realized that my lack of technical expertise was also something that could be leveraged, maybe even an asset. So once again, let me draw your attention to the first and the last. New kids are naturally inclusive, right? We're joining a new community. We're open to meeting new folks and learning new things. It just kind of comes naturally to us. And new to coding means that we're vulnerable. And vulnerability makes for brave leaders or brave superheroes, like Wonder Woman. Okay. I don't even like Wonder Woman that much. I don't know why I'm spending so much time. I mean, she's fine. She's fine. Sorry, I don't want to say anything bad. Okay, so here's my other main point. You can be a force for good in open source because of your newness. Okay, this is the last time I'm going to talk about Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman is, as many of us know, the sort of newest superhero to enter the DC, cinematic franchise. Obviously, she's been around for a long time, but she was later to come into the game, and yet the impact that she's had on the franchise is massive, right? So in a way, she's proof that you can be new but still add tremendous value, right? In ways like you all, she and you all are uniquely qualified to change these communities for the better. All right, that's it for me. I want to thank the Codeland organizers, Saran, for convincing me to do this talk when I was like, no, I shouldn't do this talk. And letting me turn all of the stuff that I've learned, sometimes by eavesdropping, into a talk. And I hope that for all of you, this is going to make your journeys that much more exciting and transformative and phenomenal and heartbreaking and educational. Thank you.